I don't know quite where to go with my opening joke, but Carol set me up in several ways. Certainly glad to be back in New York. And when Carol asked, was I glad to be here, I thought about my daughter who's 17, and every time I go to New York, she begs me to bring bagels back to Nashville because she claims there are no good bagels in the South. So I'll be getting on the plane with a big bag of New York bagels. That statement that Carol read is really quite beautiful, and I really appreciate her. I don't know where she's gone to.
Trying to turn the lights down. So
Okay. I was just giving a tribute to your statement, which I think is quite beautiful. And I also want to say that beyond participating in the Woolworth Building celebration, I was also part of a symposium on Francis Kimball that you sponsored too. And my essay in this book is on Kimball and the Trinity and U.S. Realty buildings over on Broadway. So the Skyscraper Museum has kind of been threaded through the whole project from the time that Lisa Riley and I were at UVA together in the architecture school, and she's a medievalist and I was teaching modern architecture. And oftentimes we find ourselves on master's thesis committees, and someone would say, this is a Gothic revival building, or this is a medievalizing building, and we really there was no kind of sense of what that actually meant. So we began to think more about these medieval skyscrapers as a very interesting example of a place where, as Carol pointed out, modern technology and modern functions and so on come together with this medievalizing vocabulary. And so we tried to solve a riddle, which was, what on earth did it mean to put Gothic details on a building type that was conceived of as quintessentially modern? And so we ended up teaching a seminar together. I won't tell you how many years ago because it's embarrassing that the book took so long to appear out of it. But we came to New York, and I should say we met Mary Beth Betts, who was then at the New York Historical Society and curator of the Cass Gilbert drawings, of which there are many for the Woolworth Building, as you know, and as you saw examples of in the show here. And that became one of our major starting points for our explorations. Then, fast forward to Carol's show here for the 100th anniversary of the Woolworth Building, and one of the contributors to the book, and who's an expert on the Woolworth Building, Gail Fensky, teaches in Rhode Island, got a call from two retired architects in their 90s who live in Maine, and they happen to live near where I have a cottage. And they said, well, we have this box of drawings for the Woolworth Building. Would you like to come see them? And Carol contacted me, and I said, well, actually, I'm just down the road. Can I please come with you? So we went, and they unfolded these amazing working drawings for the building, of which there were about 150 that had been in their attic for about 40 years or something. Many of them quite beautiful, just showing the design process and, of course, the revision. And long story short, we were able to purchase them at Vanderbilt for our Fine Arts Gallery collection, where we're trying to build our collection of architectural drawings. So that's been an ongoing project to catalog and conserve those, and it's fueled and continuing teaching around the skyscraper, in particular around the Woolworth Building, as iconic as you know it to be. Now, so what I want to do is just give you a sense of what's in the book. Let me go ahead for this. Carol saw this slide yesterday, and she's like, God, I hope you're not going to say this is actually accurate. And I had this in here to tell you what we don't do and what I would never presume to do, which is speak to the kind of contested history of what deserves to be called the skyscraper and what isn't, and where it was originated and all those kinds of questions, which Carol and others in the room are much more qualified to speak to than I am. But what we what I do want to talk about and what the book really addresses is this more conceptual issue of the fit, which has seemed and still sometimes seems kind of paradoxical, between Gothicizing, ornamenta, and modern structure. Now, I am teaching this course, this seminar this semester on the skyscraper, and I'm making the students read text from the 19th century aloud because I think that they should. I think everybody should, but I don't have the power to make other people do it, but I do have that with my students. I think they should really experience what debates about aesthetics and particularly about architecture were like in the 19th century. So I had them, we read aloud quite a bit of the famous essay by Louis Sullivan, The Tall Building Artistically Considered, from 1896. And I just pick out one paragraph, which I think typifies his writing. It really encompasses a problem I want to get to. He says, problem, how should we impart to this sterile pile, this crude, harsh, brutal agglomeration, this stark, staring exclamation of eternal strife, the graciousness of those higher forms of sensibility and culture that rest on the lower and fiercer passions? How should we proclaim from the dizzy height of this, and this is what I love when he strings together all these adjectives, strange, weird, modern housetop, the peaceful evangel of sentiment, of beauty, the cult of a higher life. It's staggering, right? As I said to my students the other day, can you imagine someone writing this in an architecture magazine today? I mean, no, right? But what it tells us, first of all, is I think that Sullivan is very much coming out of kind of aesthetic debate of the mid to late 19th century, in which John Ruskin was one of the premier figures. And I'll talk more in a minute about his interest in the medieval. And secondly, Carol started to get to this in her comments. The skyscraper, a commercial building, was invested around the turn of the century with this incredibly, hyperbolic language. It was considered to be something that couldn't just be a box of space. I mean, it could, but ideally the idea was that it would actually have much more aesthetic and symbolic import than that. And so you could hear Sullivan saying that he's probably the most extreme, exponent of this point of view. The building has to be, incredibly expressive of what he sees as this dynamic but weird and, in some cases, threatening sort of modern urban life. So one response, of course, as we've seen, is the medieval skyscraper, which is one way of resolving the problem that was posed, I think as Carol says in this quote, of how do you express, should you express on the exterior of a skyscraper the underlying reality of the metal frame? Should it be masked? Should it be expressed? To what degree? Etc. And as we see by the 19-teens, the Gothic becomes one way of expressing that relationship. Now, I want to go back to some early examples of what, in the debates about who originated the skyscraper, are sometimes talked about as the early contributions of New York City, George Post's Western Union building from around 1875, and the Richard Morris Hunt's New York Tribune building from about the same time. Now, what I think is really striking about these is that they, oops, I'm sorry, I was going to point, I guess I can't do that. Okay, let's see if this, worked briefly there. That both of these buildings have, to some degree, the vocabulary of a public building. So they have towers, And they have a kind of Gothicizing ornament that was specific to the post-Civil War period, sometimes called the High Victorian Gothic, that emerged from the writings of John Ruskin, who was perhaps one of the most influential aesthetic theorists or critics of the mid to late 19th century, and of course also a beautiful artist himself, to watercolors of Venice. He was the famous author of The Stones of Venice and The Seven Lamps of Architecture that came right around the midpoint of the 19th century, in which he responded to modernization and to industrialization and to the mechanization of architectural production, of the machine and factory-based production of particularly of ornament, by calling for a return to medieval-inspired methods of making buildings, craftsmanship, which in his mind would be generated by a kind of religious devotion to the natural world, which he saw as a God's creation. And that's, a zillion volumes of writing collapsed into one sentence. So it's very cursory, but for our purposes, that's kind of the important point. And Ruskin developed a way of thinking about the late Gothic, particularly Venetian wall, that was very influential for modern architects. And that the metaphor that he used was the wall veil. The wall as a kind of woven textile surface stretched over a structure. So what he admired in Venice was this kind of patterning of contrasting materials in the Doge's Palace or in the cathedrals, which you see to the right. And here they are as they actually exist today, before they are submerged. We should all go and see them. So Ruskin, of course, was a great promoter of Venice, which was also a very favored destination of late 19th century artists and writers and so on, flocked there for this watery, mysterious, inspiring landscape or cityscape. And we see in the US and in New York evidence of Ruskin's influence, which is incredibly literal in this building, which, no longer exists. The National Academy of Design by Peter B. White, where clearly he's looking at Ruskin's images and writing about Venice and then the patterning of Venetian Gothic walls and so on is very much taken up in this example. And in this example, I only realized on the plane this morning that I had given Francis Kimball a change of gender here. It's Francis, not Frances, it's a man. Very clear in this building on the left in Brooklyn, the Montauk Club from the very end of the 19th century, where clearly, he's, echoing the Venetian Gothic elements in these arcades, opening up onto the little balconies and so on. And there's a kind of polychromy going on here, which also is inspired by Ruskin as well. And you should go see this, a frieze that shows the history of the Montauk Indians, kind of unexpectedly, right, in this Venetian-inspired building, but makes a degree of sense. Now, Kimball is really interesting to many of us in this room because his trajectory was by working for a carpenter in New England and then for a number of different architects, including the English Gothic Revival architect William Burgess, who was the designer of the original part of the campus of Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, which is very much Gothic in inspiration. And subsequently, Kimball moved to New York and became well known as the quote-unquote father of the skyscraper. And did this pair of buildings on Broadway adjacent to the Trinity Churchyard, the Trinity and U.S. Realty buildings, which faced Trinity Church and deliberately responded to Trinity Church in the Gothic detailing, particularly here at the upper levels. And it was quite explicit even in the period that they wanted to pay homage to that earlier Gothic Revival church right next door. Now, so we see that Ruskin is one influential spokesperson for the reuse of the Gothic in the mid-19th century. The other one, French author, is Eugène Emmanuel Viollet-le-Duc, whose work was translated into English by the 1860s, was widely read, was influential right through the 20th century. Frank Lloyd Wright said that his Dictionary of Architecture was something like the only book, on architecture written in the 19th century that in any way helped you keep your faith in architecture. The rest he thought was sort of rubbish, but he liked Viollet-le-Duc for his writing, which, like Ruskin's, was voluminous, but he was also widely admired for these drawings that he produced. Now, the one on the right is of Notre Dame in Paris. It's a section that shows its famous flying buttresses, this famously skeletal kind of construction system that externalized the support of the vaulted, the stone vaults that covered the interior. One of the characteristics of it was its soaring quality. Now, really, one of the reasons he was so interested in the Gothic style was that he associated with the origins of the French nation. Something to keep in mind when we come back to the US and his impact here in a few minutes. He also tried to address the problem of inventing a new architecture, specifically in response to the increasingly perfected and extensive production of materials like cast and wrought iron, and a kind of design that would be, he thought, informed by what the Gothic masons had done, but transposed to modern requirements and modern materials. And so what he produces here is an audience hall for thousands of people, vaulted but using modern materials. Now, I return to a kind of spectrum of examples here to suggest that these two influences, two ways of promoting the Gothic, become important in what Ada Louise Huxtable calls the eclectic phase of skyscraper design. In her book of 1982, The Tall Office Building Artistically Reconsidered, which is a kind of conversation with Louis Sullivan. And she describes four phases: the functional, the eclectic, the modern, these are familiar to you, and the postmodern. So the phase that we're interested in is this one that really the Warth Building is one of the great examples, and it's at this moment of reinvention or moving from a more utilitarian kind of approach, she argues, towards this eclecticism that the ways of thinking about the Gothic fall into. Now, Carol mentioned that our book is revisionist, and one of the revisions that's engaged in is of this ostensibly utilitarian phase. And our author who deals with this, I think, most directly is Joanna Merwin-Salisbury, who's a great historian of Chicago architecture. And she wrote an essay for us about the Gothic revival in the Chicago school in the 1880s and 1890s. And I thought I would just quote what her argument is, because she says it better than I could. She says, this essay traces the transformation of the ideas of the Gothic in Chicago's commercial architecture from 1871 to the turn of the 20th century, focusing in particular on the transformation of the Gothic from a morally correct style to a rational, constructive principle. A transformation that enabled local architects to untether the Gothic revival from its anti-modern connotations and to embrace it as a suitable aesthetic expression for the architecture of an urbanized industrial society. So she's saying that the Gothic had these two meanings, the one, a moral meaning that's attached to it by Ruskin, and then on the other hand, this sense of it as a rational kind of design that's associated with it by Viollet-le-Duc. And she says these things are coming together in the 1880s and 1890s, and Chicago architects are able to turn the Gothic into something that speaks about the modern age through this recourse to the idea of its rationality. And so she points to buildings such as this, where the Gothic elements and the spandrel panels and in this kind of clustering of piers that we call the compound piers of original Gothic architecture. Contributors who I've already mentioned is Gail Fensky, who's the expert on the Woolworth building. And in our essay, she too, in our book, her essay for it, she also tries to tease out these different ways that the Gothic could be thought of around the turn of the century, and to show how between about 1900 and the Woolworth building, how Cass Gilbert came to a use of the Gothic that was expressive of the modern structure of this idea of height and of an underlying steel frame. And important in that context, she finds to be this great example of Louis Sullivan's skyscraper architecture here in New York, where she argues he uses motifs like these attenuated piers and the compound piers here, these little colonnettes, I should say, and capitals and so on, that she likens to the Gothic, and she says that it's here that Gilbert sees how the Gothic can be used to be expressive of this idea of height. As he moves through a series of examples, projects, the Broadway Chambers building, which is about contemporary, of course not at all Gothic, but much more classicizing here. In of course, the West Street building, 1905, were much more explicitly Gothic, much more emphasizing the vertical line in a more uninterrupted way, and of course emphasizing this idea of the crown, which visible from the harbor, from New Jersey, from many directions. And this culminates ultimately in the design for the Woolworth building, where the Gothic vocabulary suggests this underlying frame. And I was interested to see these pictures the other day and think about Carol's work on the Chrysler building and about on the Empire State Building, about the Woolworth Building, and to see that there's no big reveal, here. The spire was visible in its framed form from this relatively early point in construction. This is where, if any of you are shopping for $100 million condo, this is where, what is it, 110? Right, I round it for my students when I encourage them to come to New York after graduation. There it is. I put this in the hopes that Mary Beth would be here, because one of the early experiences in researching the Woolworth Building and taking our students to New York Historical Society was to see the variety of proposals that Gilbert made for the lobby of the Woolworth Building, and the one that he emerged with really features this much more kind of Byzantine-looking mosaic ceiling, with nonetheless Gothic elements included in the detailing around the elevator lobby here. Now, one thing that Louis Sullivan said about skyscrapers in an article written late in his life was that the space of a skyscraper was not so interesting, because after all, there were just, many floors of offices that were somewhat identical. And the exception was, of course, the lower levels with the more public spaces. And in many cases in the work of Francis Kimball, in Gilbert's, of course, there's an attempt to bring the Gothic elements into the interior with the detailing, particularly around doorways and around elevators, as we see here. Our book is, in a way, kind of anchored by two major buildings that got an enormous amount of discussion. One, of course, the Woolworth Building, and then the Chicago Tribune Building of 1922 by the architects Howells and Hood, where, again, Gothic detailing around the entranceway. And then this is, the idea of connecting the skyscraper to the history of architecture is made literal in the building, where fragments, some of them medieval, like this little guy here, this corbel sculpture, but a piece of the Colosseum, fragments of many historic buildings and renowned places are actually worked into the facade of the building to make that connection between the modern and the historical. And that's also made, of course, in the crown of the building most dramatically, with this kind of buttressing effect, particularly at the top of the building and in the detail again here. Now, the shaft of the building is where the idea of the structural writ, the Gothic idea, is then used to suggest the underlying structure of the building in various ways. Now, one of the most famous things about it was that it was the result of an international competition that generated enormous worldwide enthusiasm and projects by a number of modern architects, contemporary European architects, among them Elios Saarinen. And I contrasted here with the winning entry by Howells and Hood. So Saarinen got number 2. And in an essay written about a year before he died, Louis Sullivan, in 1923, wrote an essay in which he made a kind of lasting interpretation of the competition, which was called the most beautiful office building in the world, which was what the phrase that he comes back to in that essay, which was the phrase used by the Chicago Tribune to describe what they wanted their headquarters to be. And he creates this kind of dichotomy between, on the one hand, the winning entry, and on the other hand, what he sees as the more important contribution in Saarinen's entry. So it goes on and on. I won't read you a lot, but I'll read you one paragraph to give you the feeling of it. He says, masters of ideas are masters of courage. The free will of adventure is in them. They stride where others creep. The pride of action is in them. They explore, they test, they seek realities to meet them face to face. Knowing well that realities and illusions exist commingled within and without, but also knowing well that ego is its own. Hence they walked erect and fearless in the open, with certitude which vision brings, while slaves are slaves by choice. They seek shelter in the shadows of ideas, or in the shadows of ideas. So he constructs this dichotomy between what he sees as the kind of far-reaching, creator of ideas, Elio Saarinen, and on the other hand, he sees this very timid expression in the winning design. Saarinen would come to the U.S. to become a very influential architectural educator, as would Walter Gropius in the mid-1930s, and become a very important educator at Harvard. And you see this really interesting contribution that he made. And in our book, our contributor who deals with the Tribune building, Kate Solomonson, who's the author of a monograph on it, takes her analysis in a new direction. She talks about this in the wake of World War I, and the way that the Gothic cathedral, which we already saw, had been understood as the expression of rational construction, of moral building, becomes, because of the destruction of French cathedrals by the Germans, a cause which Americans felt very connected to. It becomes a kind of nationalistic form as well. So she takes it in that direction. And then our book also moves outward and chronologically beyond and geographically beyond the Tribune Tower to look at some later examples that show the influence of that competition, like our own Radiator building here in New York, which continues this idea of the skyscraper as a dramatic gesture by corporate clients. Of course, that has hardly diminished over the years. Here you see it again, here facing Bryant Park, of course, with the Empire State in the background. And again, Gothic detailing around the ground floor entranceway. And it comes around in the 1920s, and then at the same moment is born this project, which some of you may know. This is the so-called Cathedral of Learning at the University of Pittsburgh by Charles Clowder, the architect who invents for the University of Pittsburgh this skyscraper. And so our question was, why would the University of Pittsburgh, rather than have a more conventional kind of educational building, want to put its campus in a skyscraper? And what the essayist who deals with this building describes is a kind of a little bit of a phenomenon of universities wanting to use skyscraper forms for their buildings as a way of signaling how modern they were. And that's the case for Pittsburgh. As you can see here, there's a kind of prestige associated with the telescoping skyscraper used as an educational building. And here's the interior, and it looks for all the world, don't tell the medievalists I said this, like the interior of a Gothic cathedral, right? Now, and here it is, you see it, now this is interesting, in conjunction with the Heinz Chapel built by the Heinz family, which you know from Pittsburgh about the same time. So this is, very kind of collegiate Gothic building. So there was a tradition as you know, of Gothic buildings for college and university campuses. And it's updated, and this building right behind it in a skyscraper, and there it is at night, extremely dramatic. And here you see it in context, which is really interesting because, you know, it's much easier to be tall in Pittsburgh than in Manhattan, right? Or Chicago. So it absolutely, this historic view from about the time it was finished, looms above these very kind of typical Pittsburgh wonderful houses of about 3 stories. I mean, this is really the height of the buildings around them, and then this stands out so dramatically in the landscape. It's still, you know, as you know, a major landmark in Pittsburgh. Here's an aerial view from around the time of its completion. Here it is. You can see how it looms over everything around it. But I think the picture is great because it links conceptually the Cathedral of Learning with the steel factories over here on the river, right? So Pittsburgh, the steel town, right? It's all about, you know, the materials of the heroic, you know, modern construction. And so it's, I think, thought to be appropriate to have a skyscraper, which is, after all, dependent upon the steel industry, as this major landmark for the University of Pittsburgh. So this shows by 1930 or so, there's this national spread of the skyscraper used for a wide variety of forms. One thing that we don't cover in our book that I wish we had was the skyscraper church, which was also a phenomenon. There were proposals for skyscraper churches around the same period, showing that the type was being adapted to other uses. Among them, the City Hall of Atlanta from 1930 by Southern architect G. Lloyd Preacher. So here's what they had before, which I think makes you think back to the very beginning of the lecture in those commercial buildings of the post-Civil War period, with this kind of polychromy, different colored materials, brick and stone, very visibly Gothic elements, but this is a real Ruskinian Gothic, a Ruskin Venetian-inspired Gothic, typical of the High Victorian period. So, intriguingly, in the 1920s, they decided to build a new city hall. They retained this idea that the Gothic is an appropriate vocabulary for a public building, but it's now the Skyscraper Gothic. And this building, I can't overestimate how much they bragged about it in Atlanta. It was seen as a real symbol of what they hoped to be, which was a kind of commercial crossroads of the South, corresponding to what Chicago was for the Midwest and really for the nation as a whole, what it still is. Oops, I'm sorry. And, you know, there were publications called things like Forward Atlanta, you know, and they would say, you know, unbelievably, it was just, you know, a few decades ago that we were burned to the ground, but we're rising like a phoenix. So that's always, of course, the metaphor that's used. And in this context, the skyscraper underscored their belief that they would have this national commercial standing. Here it is again, and you see these kind of Gothic elements. So the other day when I was telling my students about this, they kind of said, how tall is that? Because, you know, in comparison, of course, to other places, it's not, you know, soaring in the manner of New York or Chicago, but when you see it in context, and this is from the 60s or something, this image, you can see how, you know, like in Pittsburgh, you know, a tall building, the bar is, you know, somewhat lower, and it looms over everything around it. That's probably enhanced by the fact that, you know, of course, Atlanta is a city of traffic jams and highways, as you can see here, and much of it torn down for parking lots and so on. But even in its original setting, it really stood apart with this open space around it. And look, here's the Capitol building with that vocabulary that we associate with state capitals, with the dome and the portico and so on, and the national capitol, of course, too. And it just shows the emphatic step away from that neoclassicism that was made in buildings such as this from around 1930, as they tried to capitalize on the notoriety, for better or for worse, of the Woolworth building and of the Chicago Tribune building. Now, I put this in here to stand for the moment of the ascendancy of a kind of international style modernism in skyscraper design, at which point things like the Woolworth building and the Tribune building seemed particularly ludicrous to many critics and historians, at a moment where that appeal to historical forms in the design of a very contemporary building seemed like a very paradoxical and sort of backward approach. But it would be reborn at the end of the 20th century, a moment at which, as I said, Ada Louise Huxtable writes this essay about the skyscraper, in which she says the 20th century architect's most telling and lasting response to his age is the topless tower of trade. So obviously she likes alliteration. But there's also something, I think, I really admire her choice of this term, of the use of the word topless here, because it suggests a kind of, raciness, or a kind of daring and kind of scandalousness in that race to build higher buildings. And by the time of her writing, they return to a kind of historic vocabulary, in quotation marks, in the AT&T building, as you can see here, gripped by its architect, Philip Johnson, here on the right, and in a building such as this, which returns us to Pittsburgh, returns us to the steel industry, which made the skyscraper possible to some extent. This is, of course, 1981, moment of postmodernism, and you can see now the Gothic skyscraper has itself become an historic style that can be invoked in a postmodern building. I'll stop there.
Any questions?
Yes.
You said about the moral aspect of the Gothic language there. I don't know, could you just explain that a little bit, what particularly about it was moral, and how maybe that was recruited by the...
How was what? I'm sorry?
How was recruited, how that aspect was capitalized?
Right. So the two major spokespeople, as you maybe know, of that point of view, at the middle of the 19th century are John Ruskin and William Morris, who are responding to the fundamental change in the way things were produced as a result of industrialization. And they're looking, among other things, at the building trades, where no longer do you need a trained craftsman, right, to make a piece of decoration or molding or something for a building, but instead you can make those in factories. And there doesn't have the maker, who is the worker operating machinery and so on, doesn't have to have any particular investment in that making, moral or spiritual or anything else, artistic. And so, this is their point of view. So they are lamenting what they understood in a very romanticized way to have been the Middle Ages, when buildings were built by guild, workers who were joined together in a guild, and who they felt were inspired by kind of religious fervor to invest a lot of themselves in the making of the building, and to also have a lot of autonomy for design. And so they advocated a return in response to industrialization, the mechanization of production, to a kind of traditional, guild-based production in which the workers would have an authentic and deep relationship to their product. And for them, that was freighted with a moral obligation or moral meaning. So it's a whole attempt to make building not just a practical question, but a moral one as well. And so that moralism was threaded through understandings of the Gothic for at least some writers who were widely read in the US. And so then those associations were carried through in revival buildings. But what were you going to say?
Well, those authors, why do they think that the Gothic artisans were more moral than the classical or Romanesque or any other periods before?
Because they saw them as, of course this is all like totally, specious in some way, but, they saw them as being free. That as joining together kind of freely out of their passion for building and their obedience to God to make things. They weren't compelled by the pharaohs to build the pyramids, or they weren't, forced by any, other authority. They actually wanted to do that. And so, there was also there's this kind of myth of the cult of carts, which you may have heard of, about the building of cathedrals, that people were so inspired by the projects that they took their carts and they put money and building materials and so on, and dragged them up to the building site to make a personal contribution. Now we know more modern scholarship tells us that in many cases people were compelled to give money to cathedral and church building projects in the Middle Ages, or their efforts were extorted in various ways. But in the 19th century, the idea was that there was this kind of spontaneous fervor that culminated in building. And that was very appealing in a period that saw the increasing, as Marx said, alienation of labor from production. So it was an image of the Middle Ages that was concocted out of a anxiety about the present. Yes?
Gail Fensky in her Woolworth building refers to the Cathedral of Commerce. And
Right.
I think here's a case where this symbolic purity of the cathedral has been branded and taken as part of retail commerce. Which is incredibly interesting to see the symbolism move from content to form, or form to content, depending
Right,
on...
although that wasn't Gilbert's intention,
of
as
course.
Mary Bethel, I think, confirmed.
Yes, yes.
He was looking at guild halls and, secular Gothic models, but that term, the Cathedral of Commerce, sticks
No.
when it gets applied to it, and, the Cathedral of Learning, and, the term gets used for various kinds of buildings that have some of the vocabulary of religious buildings. But that is really interesting, the idea that the vocabulary that's really basically associated with Christian buildings becomes, however you want, for better or for worse, associated with commercial and civic buildings. And urbanistically it's important because, of course, the cathedral was thought of as the looming element of a traditional city, and so too the skyscraper was the defining element of a skyline. And so there was a kind of correspondence there between the traditional and the modern city.
I have a kind of esoteric art historical question, it's something that occurred to me. I think I asked the question, I never got an answer when I was reading essays, because as you posed, there are very simplistically definitions of medieval that have to do with masonry, Gothic with masonry, and then as Viollet-le-Duc argued that the structural logic of Gothic was a way to connect it to modern ideas. And then there's this third aspect of Gothic, which I think wasn't mentioned by the various essayists, that also relates to the skyscraper directly, and that is the idea of light, a light-filled building, which in the era of before artificial light, this idea of dependence on daylight to illuminate the space and make the windows as large as possible. Because you showed us the Fisher building or Tacoma building, or whichever, or I guess we saw, what did we say, Tacoma? And it was Adler, I think, rather than Sullivan, who talked about the great desideratum of the skyscraper, which was light.
Right.
And it was Abbot Suger who talked about the windows was in order to allow the heavenly light into the cathedral, and that was the essence of Gothic.
Right. When you were talking, I just read your essay about the Empire State Building the other day. Building the Empire State, and there you make the point that the size of the windows, maximizing those was all important. The distance from of every desk from a window was extremely important in the design of the building. So that idea of light is really important. The metaphor of the Gothic cathedral as a kind of skeletal vessel with glass wrapped around it so that it becomes light-filled is a really popular metaphor still today, but certainly in this period it was. Now, the one difference is that for Suger, in the Middle Ages, the light was not supposed to be white. It was colored light. And the idea was, back to my intro to history of architecture lecture on Abbot Suger, the anagogical principle of light, which was this idea that in the way that if you're in a dusty room and you see the light coming through, you see the particles of dust in the light, he wanted the light to be visible because of the use of stained glass, and spiritually that would then lead you to a kind of higher realm, to a kind of heavenly realm. So it's a slightly different idea of light, but that said, that idea of the skeletal vessel with a lot of windows, sure, is absolutely analogous. Yeah.
Any other questions? If not, you have the opportunity to purchase a book if you like to, or review it here. There's some at the top of the table, but the bookstore is down there, and we also have wine and water and pretzels over in that corner in order to have a reception and just circulate and ask questions informally. So thank you very much for coming. Let me remind you that there is yet another October author's talk, and that's by John Hill, who will make his second appearance in the year 2017 because he has prolifically produced another book called How to Build a Skyscraper, which is a collection also of kind of individual buildings featured. So that's on October 24th. So you can come back for that, and also Mike Wallace on Greater Gotham on November 14th. So we have quite an array of authors and topics. So thank you for coming.
Thanks very much.
This exhibition is Millennium, Lower Manhattan in the 1990s, and it looks at 20 years ago the situation in downtown, which was in the midst of a real estate slump but trying to reinvent itself, coming in the late 90s a little bit out of that bad situation and emerging according to public policy as a place that had more diversity than just the financial district, but residents and changes towards a new kind of Lower Manhattan. And so we had the idea to look at that history with the millennium, the year 2000, as a marker, and to think how do we think about these things differently with our knowledge of 9/11 and the way that history changes with these cataclysmic events. So this is the kind of exercise of this show, but in particular, it was predicated and inspired by something which is in that case, and you see on the back wall over there that I want to mention. It's a revival of a public history project called Heritage Trails that maybe some of you remember from downtown in the 1990s, from 1998, the historical markers, some of which still exist in places in Lower Manhattan, but the panels that describe the history of downtown sites have most of them been, rewritten, and that project is no longer recognizable as it was originally conceived. But the museum undertook to commemorate the author, the kind of driving force of that project, who was Richard Kaplan, who died last year, and to create a digital footprint for Heritage Trails. And we have brochures that you can see in the front, and you can find on your phone the original Heritage Trails and follow it, and also get the updated 20 years from 1998 to the present in the history that transpired during that period. So that was the idea that drove this exhibition, and we're going to be exploring those ideas over a series of programs that will be mounted in the months this continues to occupy our space. So I guess now we've got lots of people sitting in the chairs, and it's really officially time to begin. So let me give a little bit of background on Kevin Murphy and the book Skyscraper Gothic that some of you I know have already seen, and maybe in some of you I think know Kevin from his years in New York, because he has been an art history professor for all of his career, but from 1998, isn't it? Do I remember correctly? At CUNY. Any students from CUNY? Go back. There's a couple of them here. Where he taught in the art history department and at the graduate center and directed the PhD program until he was in 2013 stolen away by Vanderbilt. So he's now situated in the South, in Nashville, and so are you happy to be back in New York?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so we're welcoming him back. I guess the South maybe we associate with Gothic of a different kind more than we do necessarily New York, except for, and this is not a New York building, but our Gothic skyscraper, of course, is the Woolworth building, and indeed. Kevin contributed to the celebration of the 100-year anniversary of the Woolworth building that we did in the symposium called Medieval or Modern. So this idea of examining the kind of simultaneous modernity of the skyscraper and the medieval style in the kind of classic art history of the years of my training way back 30 going on 40 years ago of art history. The idea of the battle of the styles is a way of framing the early history of the skyscraper, especially in New York. Because how do you take this modern thing and express its verticality, express its legitimacy as an architectural creation? Because these are commercial buildings, and it was that kind of territory, I think, that largely dominated the history of the skyscraper generally in the years some 3 decades ago about thinking of the skyscraper. But this is a different book that looks to scholars who had a revisionist view of that idea, of an idea about styles, but about other things, other issues, and so. It is a collection by 8 or so different scholars that Kevin and Lisa Riley have collected and edited and presented in this handsome little book. And because they asked me to read the essays first and maybe write something about it. And I'm reading here what I did write, which apparently I thought about quite a lot, because I figured I would just say what I said back here about the book, because it really did kind of summarize well some of the issues. So the Skyscrapers proved to be America's great continuing contribution to the history of world architecture. But its early years presented a conundrum to architects and the client: how to dress the modernity of its steel frame in the mantle of artistic style and cultural meaning. For many reasons, as the 8 contributors to this volume show, Gothic was a logical choice. Vertical, skeletal, spiritual, aspiring. How extraordinary that this is the first book to address these manifold meanings of Skyscraper Gothic, and it is. It's supposed to do that, so we have Kevin Murphy to thank for thinking of pulling this all together. And now he's going to give you an overview, more or less, of the effort.